Sabrina has been deaf since birth and right-hand dominant her entire life. Something as fundamental to who she is as the color of her eyes or the sound of her laugh that I could hear, but she never would. When we were kids, probably no older than 8 and 10, we made a pact after watching some ridiculous action movie where the hero had a secret distress signal. We were dramatic kids who watched too many spy movies, the kind who built blanket forts and pretended they were safe houses, who whispered about escape routes and code words like we were living in some grand adventure instead of a quiet suburban neighborhood where the biggest danger was Mrs. Henderson's aggressive sprinkler system. But we shook on it, linked our pinkies together with the kind of solemnity only children can muster, and made our promise. Left hand equals help me. Left hand means real danger, the kind you can't talk your way out of, the kind that requires someone else to see what you're too scared to say out loud. 23 years had passed since that summer afternoon in our backyard. 23 years of Sunday dinners and birthday parties and graduations and holidays, and she'd never used it once, not even as a joke, because we both understood on some level that you don't joke about the emergency signal, you keep it sacred and hope to God you never need it. Every Sunday dinner would be at my parents' house, a tradition as reliable as the sunrise, where the table would groan under the weight of my mom's cooking, and the conversation would flow in a mixture of voices and hands, creating this beautiful chaos that was uniquely ours. Sabrina arrived with Brandon that particular Sunday, my childhood best friend, the guy I'd known since we were both gap-toothed kids, trading Pokemon cards at recess, the one everyone's favorite because he had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room when he talked to you. He'd learned ASL to date her, spent months taking classes and practicing, and my parents called him their bonus son. With such genuine affection, it made my chest warm every time I heard it, made me think that maybe my best friend and my sister had found something real and lasting, something that would keep us all connected forever. At the table that night, though, something felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate, like when you walk into a room and know someone was just arguing even though everyone's silent now. Sabrina barely ate, her fork pushing food around her plate in listless circles while the rest of us laughed and talked, while Brandon cut her food without asking, his knife scraping against the ceramic in this methodical, possessive way that made my stomach clench even though I couldn't explain why. She kept her eyes down the entire meal, her shoulders hunched forward like she was trying to make herself smaller, shrinking into herself in a way that was so unlike the Sabrina I knew, the one who'd always taken up space unapologetically, who'd never met an argument she wouldn't enthusiastically join. After dessert, my mom's famous apple pie that usually had Sabrina asking for seconds, she hugged me goodbye, and her left hand came up to sign, "I love you," in that familiar gesture we'd all done 1,000 times. Except it was wrong. It was all wrong because it was her left hand forming those shapes, her non-dominant hand moving in this deliberate, unmistakable signal that sent ice water through my veins. My spidey sense tingled, every nerve in my body suddenly alert and screaming that something was catastrophically wrong. She pulled back fast, faster than natural, refusing to meet my eyes like she knew what she'd just done and was terrified I'd seen it. Terrified I'd understood. Brandon appeared beside her almost instantly, like he'd been watching for this exact moment, signing and speaking simultaneously in that fluid way he'd perfected over 2 years of dating my sister. "Ready, babe?" he asked with that easy smile that had charmed my entire family, that had made my dad clap him on the shoulder and my mom hug him tight and me think I'd gained a brother. I grabbed her arm, not hard but firm, and she flinched so hard it was like I'd struck her, her whole body recoiling from my touch in a way that made my heart drop into my stomach. "Stay longer," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, even though my pulse was hammering in my ears, even though that childhood signal was blaring in my head like an alarm. Brandon laughed that easy laugh everyone trusted, the one that said he was the most reasonable person in any room, the one that had gotten him out of trouble our entire lives. "3 hours is enough, man," he said, and there was something in his tone, something just slightly off, that I might not have caught if I wasn't already looking for it. I looked directly at Sabrina, ignoring him completely, focusing all my attention on my sister, who seemed to be disappearing right in front of me. "Do you want to stay?" I asked, watching her face, watching the way her eyes flickered with something that looked like hope before it was smothered by fear. She glanced at Brandon first before shaking her head, and that one glance told me everything I needed to know. That one split second of checking for permission before answering a simple question screamed volumes in the silence. I didn't let go of her arm, my fingers gentle but insistent. "I'm asking her, not you," I said, and I heard the edge in my own voice, the hardness creeping in. My dad walked over from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his expression already concerned because he could read the tension in the room like it was written in neon. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between us. Sabrina signed with her right hand, quick and defensive. "I'm fine," but the hand trembled visibly, shaking like a leaf in a storm, and I watched Brandon's eyes track that movement, watched something flicker across his face. Brandon squeezed her shoulder in what probably looked like affection to anyone not paying attention, and she went completely rigid, every muscle in her body locking up, her face draining of all color, until she looked like she might pass out right there in our parents' foyer. This was the girl who used to argue with everyone about everything, who'd never backed down from a fight in her life, who'd always been fearless and fierce, and now she just stood there, silent and terrified, looking like a shadow of herself. My mom appeared from the dining room, drawn by the commotion, her face already creased with worry. "What's happening?" she asked, but I couldn't look away from Sabrina, couldn't stop cataloging all the things I'd missed, all the signs I should have seen. I stared at my sister, really seeing her for the first time tonight, maybe for the first time in months. She'd lost 20 pounds, maybe more, her clothes hanging off her frame in a way that looked wrong, unhealthy. She wore long sleeves in July, in the middle of a heat wave when everyone else was in tank tops and shorts, the fabric pulled down past her wrists like she was hiding something. She had dark circles under her eyes, purple-black shadows that spoke of sleepless nights and stress, and her skin had this grayish tinge that made her look sick. "I need to talk to Sabrina alone," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me was churning. My mom's face hardened instantly, her expression shifting to something protective and defensive. "After everything Brandon has done for this family?" she said, and I could hear the disbelief in her voice, the accusation that I was being unreasonable, ungrateful, crazy. Brandon held up his hands in that patient gesture everyone loved so much, that martyred tolerance that made him look like the reasonable one, like I was the problem. "Sabrina, do you want to talk to your brother alone?" he asked, and the question sounded so reasonable, so caring, except I watched him watch her, watched the way his eyes carried a message that his words didn't. Sabrina looked at him, then at me, then shook her head, and I knew she was too scared to say yes, too terrified of what would happen later if she agreed. "Show me your arms, Sabrina," I said, and my voice came out harder than I intended, desperate and demanding. The room went completely silent, everyone frozen in this tableau of confusion and tension, the air so thick you could choke on it. "Take off the sweater," I said, and I heard my mom gasp behind me. My dad stepped toward me, his hand reaching out like he was going to physically move me. "You don't get to demand anything," he said, his voice carrying that parental authority that had made me comply my whole life. "If everything's fine, she can show me," I said, holding my ground, planting my feet, and refusing to back down, even though I could feel everyone's anger and confusion pressing against me like a physical force. Brandon's voice stayed eerily calm, too calm, unnaturally smooth. "You're being crazy," he said, and the word was chosen deliberately, designed to make me doubt myself, to make everyone else doubt me. Sabrina turned to Brandon and signed something desperate and fast, her hands moving in frantic shapes I couldn't quite follow, and I saw the plea in her movement, the begging quality of it. He nodded slowly, deliberately, put his arm around her in what looked like comfort, but felt like possession, and started moving her toward the door with this gentle but inexorable pressure. I stepped in front of them, blocking their path, making myself an obstacle they couldn't ignore. "Sabrina, look at me," I said, and my voice cracked on her name. She did for just 1 second, just one horrible second where our eyes met, and in that second, I saw pure terror in her eyes, the kind of fear that makes your blood run cold, that makes you understand that you're looking at someone who is drowning and can't scream for help. Brandon pulled her faster toward the exit, his movements becoming more urgent, less careful about maintaining the facade. My dad's voice went hard and threatening, a tone I'd only heard a handful of times in my life. "Move. Now," he ordered, and I could feel the weight of his disapproval, could feel my mom's hands on my arm trying to pull me aside. "Not until Sabrina signs it herself," I said, refusing to budge even an inch, my body a wall between them and the door. "Not through Brandon," I added, because that felt important, crucial even, that she speak for herself, that her words come unfiltered and uninterpreted. Brandon was clearly losing his patience now, the mask slipping at the edges, his jaw clenched tight. "She did tell you, through me," he said, and there was an edge there now, something sharp cutting through the smoothness. Sabrina was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, while my mom tried to pull me aside with increasing urgency, her voice rising with panic and anger. "You're upsetting her. Stop this right now," she pleaded. But I couldn't. I couldn't back down because 23 years ago I'd made a promise, and that left hand had been a signal, and I couldn't ignore it now. I planted my feet firmly in front of the door, not moving an inch, my body blocking the exit completely. "Sabrina, do you want to go home with Brandon? Sign it directly to me," I demanded, and I tried to make my voice gentle, tried to let her know she was safe, that I would protect her. Sabrina lifted her hands slowly, so slowly it was agonizing to watch, and started with her right hand, then froze completely, her hands suspended in midair like she'd been turned to stone. She looked at Brandon like she was asking for permission to continue, seeking approval for something as simple as answering a question, and that look made me want to punch something. Brandon smiled, but his eyes had gone completely cold and dead, like looking into a shark's eyes, empty of everything except calculation. "Go ahead, babe," he said, and the permission was a threat, a reminder of power and consequences. Sabrina's hands dropped to her sides and she sobbed harder, her whole body shaking violently with the force of her crying, her breath coming in gasps. That's when Brandon went completely still, his entire body language changing in an instant, staring at Sabrina with an expression I'd never seen before, something ugly and dangerous that had always been hiding under the surface. The warmth vanished entirely from his face, replaced by something cold and controlling and absolutely terrifying in its intensity. "Sabrina, look at me. Now," he commanded, and his voice had changed too, sharp and hard, and leaving no room for disobedience. She looked up at him like a cornered animal, and I watched him sign something sharp and fast and angry, his hands moving in aggressive slashes that made her flinch. She shook her head violently in response, backing away from him, and he signed again, slower this time, more deliberate and threatening, each movement carrying weight and menace. She backed into the wall behind her, trapped between him and the solid surface. Nowhere left to go. My dad saw the complete change in Brandon's expression and body language, saw the transformation from charming boyfriend to something else entirely. "Brandon, what did you just sign to her?" he demanded, his voice sharp with alarm. Brandon ignored him completely, his focus locked on Sabrina with laser intensity, like nobody else in the room even existed. "We're leaving," he stated, and it wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, a command that expected compliance. He grabbed Sabrina's arm hard and possessive, his fingers digging into her flesh, leaving no room for argument or resistance. I shoved his hand off her, putting my body between them, adrenaline flooding my system. "Don't touch her," I said, and I didn't recognize my own voice, didn't recognize this protective fury that was consuming me. Brandon's voice turned ice cold, dropping all pretense of civility. "Get out of my way," he said, and there was no more mask, no more pretending. The nice guy was completely gone, replaced by this cold, controlling presence that had probably always been there underneath. That's when Sabrina's hands started moving, both hands signing frantically, desperately, words pouring out of her in a flood that had been dammed up for too long, everything she'd been holding back suddenly breaking free. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and started translating through tears, her voice breaking as she spoke the words Sabrina's hands were forming. 6 months of isolation, of being cut off from everyone and everything she knew. Brandon monitoring everything, every single text message, every phone call, every email, reading them all, controlling who she talked to and what she said, telling her what to wear, what to eat, when to sleep, controlling every aspect of her life down to the smallest detail. He'd been using his ASL to lie for her, deliberately changing her words when he interpreted for others, making her sound happy and grateful and in love when she was screaming for help in a language only he could hear. My dad grabbed Brandon, his patience finally snapping, and shoved him toward the door with force, anger radiating from every line of his body. Brandon looked back at Sabrina with dead eyes, eyes that held no warmth or love or humanity. "You're nothing without me," he said, and the words were meant to wound, meant to control even as he was being forced out. My dad threw him out physically, pushed him through the door and locked it behind him, the deadbolt sliding home with a solid click. Brandon's car screeched away into the night, the sound of his tires screaming against the pavement fading into the distance. Sabrina collapsed on the couch, her body giving out, still signing even as she fell, the words continuing to pour out. Bruises covered both arms, purple and yellow and green marks in the shape of fingers, evidence of violence that the long sleeves had hidden. Brandon had hidden her hearing aids, cutting off even the small amount of sound she could access, isolating her further. He'd isolated her from the deaf community, from the people who understood her, from the connections that had always sustained her. He'd bought a ring to propose next month, planning to trap her permanently, to lock her into this nightmare forever. Her hands finally stopped moving, and she looked at me, exhausted, drained, empty. "I didn't think you'd remember," she signed, her movements slow and tired. "We were kids," she added, like our childhood pact was too small and silly to have survived into adulthood. My mom held Sabrina tight, gathering her into her arms like she was still a little girl. "We should have seen it," she whispered, rocking her daughter, tears streaming down her face. My dad checked the locks, double-checking and triple-checking, making sure Brandon couldn't get back in. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion and regret. Sabrina leaned into them, finally safe, finally home, finally able to breathe without fear. I sat beside her on the couch, close enough to touch, to protect, to remind her she wasn't alone. 23 years I'd waited for that signal, secretly hoping I'd never see it. But when it came, I'd been ready. Update. Mom helped Sabrina upstairs to her old bedroom, the one that still had her high school posters on the walls and her childhood stuffed animals lined up on the shelf. Dad stayed downstairs checking every window lock twice, then 3 times, testing each one with enough force that I worried he might break something. I sat on the couch where Sabrina had collapsed just minutes before, staring at the spot where her tears had soaked into the fabric. Sleep felt impossible, like trying to rest while standing on train tracks with a locomotive bearing down. Mom came back down around midnight and made tea nobody drank, her hands shaking so badly the cups rattled against the saucers. She went back upstairs to check on Sabrina, then came down, then went back up an hour later, her footsteps creaking on the stairs in a rhythm that became the night's soundtrack. I lay on the couch replaying every Sunday dinner from the past 2 years like torture, seeing things I'd been too blind to notice before, the way Brandon always sat between Sabrina and the rest of us, creating this physical barrier, how he'd answer questions directed at her before she could respond, his interpretations now obviously twisted. The time she'd reached for seconds, and he'd said she'd had enough, and we'd all laughed like it was sweet concern instead of control. Her smile never reaching her eyes, her shoulders always hunched, making herself smaller and smaller until she'd nearly disappeared. Dad never left his post by the front door, sitting in the armchair Mom usually claimed, his phone in his lap like he expected Brandon to call or show up. Around 3 in the morning, I found him in the kitchen making coffee, his eyes red. Neither of us spoke, just stood there in the dark, drinking bitter coffee, and failing to find words for the guilt crushing both of us. Morning came gray and cold despite the July heat, the kind of exhausted dawn that feels like the night never really ended. Sabrina emerged from her room wearing Mom's old pajamas, the fabric hanging loose on her frame in a way that made her look like a kid playing dress-up in adult clothes. Mom had made scrambled eggs and toast, Sabrina's favorite breakfast since childhood, but Sabrina just stared at the plate like she'd forgotten what food was for. Her hands shook so badly, she could barely hold the fork, the metal clattering against the ceramic every time she tried to lift it. She managed 2 bites before giving up, pushing the plate away with trembling fingers. We all sat there pretending to eat while actually just watching Sabrina, this horrible awareness settling over us, that family love wasn't enough to fix what Brandon had broken. She needed real help, professional help, people who understood trauma and abuse and how to put someone back together when they'd been systematically destroyed. I excused myself while Sabrina was in the shower, taking my phone into the backyard where our childhood fort used to stand. The domestic violence hotline number came up first in my search, and I called before I could overthink it. The advocate who answered had this calm, steady voice that made me want to cry, like finally talking to someone who understood. She asked questions I hadn't known to consider, about Sabrina's safety, and Brandon's patterns, and whether he had access to weapons. Then she said she knew someone who specialized in working with deaf survivors, a guy named Declan Rivers, who ran programs at the local advocacy center. She could connect me right now if I wanted, and I said yes so fast the word came out like a gasp. Declan picked up on the second ring, his voice carrying this relief when I described getting Sabrina out, like he'd been waiting for this exact call. He said he could meet us that afternoon at 2, that we'd done the right thing, that the hardest part was often just getting the victim away from the abuser. I hung up feeling like we'd finally found someone who knew how to navigate what came next, someone with a map for this nightmare we'd stumbled into. At 11 that morning, we drove Sabrina to Dr. Patterson's office, our family doctor who'd known Sabrina since birth. Dad had called ahead explaining the situation, and Dr. Patterson cleared her schedule to see us immediately. The waiting room felt too bright, too normal. Magazines about gardening and healthy recipes like the world outside wasn't full of people hurting each other. Dr. Patterson was gentle when she called Sabrina back, explaining through Mom's interpretation that she needed to document everything for legal purposes, that photographs and medical records could be crucial evidence. Sabrina nodded and followed her into the exam room, Mom going with her while Dad and I stayed in the waiting room. We sat in those uncomfortable plastic chairs, not talking, both of us struggling with rage that had nowhere useful to go. Through the closed door, we could hear Sabrina crying, these quiet sobs that somehow hurt worse than screaming would have. Dr. Patterson took photos of bruises on both arms, her ribs, her back, all the places long sleeves and baggy clothes had hidden. Some were fresh, purple and tender, while others had faded to yellow and green, proof this had been going on for months. The exam took 40 minutes that felt like hours, and when they came out, Mom's eyes were swollen from crying, and Sabrina looked hollowed out, like the documentation had cost her something vital. Dr. Patterson handed Mom a thick folder of records and photos, her expression tight with anger she was trying to keep professional. My phone started buzzing around noon, Brandon's name lighting up the screen with texts that came in rapid succession. The first one said he loved Sabrina and he was sorry, that he'd made mistakes, but they could work through this. 20 minutes later, another text came through saying Sabrina was nothing without him and I was going to regret turning her against him. Then another apology, then another threat, this wild swing between begging and menacing that showed exactly how unstable he'd become. I showed Dad, who immediately called our phone carrier and got us all new numbers while I took screenshots of every message for evidence. The Advocacy Center was a low brick building near downtown, the kind of place you'd drive past 100 times without noticing. Declan met us in the lobby, a tall guy maybe in his 40s with kind eyes and this immediate competence that made me trust him. He'd brought Carly Schaefer with him, an ASL interpreter and advocate who Sabrina could communicate with directly. For the first time since last night, I watched Sabrina's hands move freely, signing with Carly without that constant fear of Brandon watching and controlling her words. They talked for almost an hour, Sabrina's hands getting faster and more animated as she realized Carly was actually listening, actually understanding, not filtering everything through Brandon's translations. Declan explained to Mom, Dad, and me about typical patterns of abuse in deaf relationships, how abusers often use language access as the primary control mechanism. They isolate victims from the deaf community, control all interpretation, manipulate what gets communicated to hearing family members. Brandon had been doing exactly that, changing Sabrina's words whenever he interpreted for her, making her sound happy and grateful when she was screaming for help in a language only he could hear. Declan's voice got serious when he talked about the next 48 hours, explaining that getting Sabrina out was just the first step. Statistically, this was the most dangerous time, when the abuser had lost control and might escalate to get it back. We needed to move quickly on legal protections, especially a restraining order that would make it a crime for Brandon to contact or approach Sabrina. We started the paperwork right there in his office, Carly interpreting everything directly for Sabrina, so she understood and consented to each step. The forms asked for specific incidents, dates, descriptions of abuse, and Sabrina's hands moved steadily as she recounted details that made Mom grip the arms of her chair. By evening, Dad had hired a locksmith who showed up with a van full of equipment. He changed every lock on every door, installed deadbolts that required keys from both sides, added chain locks and security bars. While he worked, another guy from a security company set up cameras covering all entrances, motion sensors on the windows, a monitored alarm system that would alert police if triggered. Our quiet suburban home was turning into a fortress, and I hated that this was necessary. Hated that Sabrina couldn't feel safe in the place where she grew up. But watching Dad oversee every installation with this fierce determination, I understood he was doing the only thing he could to protect his daughter. That night, a judge reviewed Sabrina's written statement and the medical photos Dr. Patterson had taken. The emergency restraining order got approved within hours, legally requiring Brandon to stay at least 500 feet away from Sabrina, our family home, and any place he knew she went regularly. Violation meant immediate arrest, no questions asked. Declan called to tell us the news, and we all breathed a little easier, though he warned that restraining orders were just paper, and Brandon's compliance depended on his self-control, which clearly wasn't reliable. The next morning, Detective Winston McGee from the Domestic Violence Unit came to take Sabrina's formal statement. He was patient and respectful, using Carly to interpret and taking breaks when Sabrina got overwhelmed by recounting specific incidents. Winston explained that based on her statement and the medical evidence, they had grounds for criminal charges including assault, unlawful restraint, and coercion. If convicted, Brandon could face actual jail time, years behind bars for what he'd done. The interview took 3 hours, Winston asking detailed questions about dates and times and specific acts of violence or control, building a case brick by brick. When Winston finally packed up his recorder and thick folder of notes, the afternoon sun was already slanting through the windows at that tired angle that meant hours had passed without any of us noticing. He shook Dad's hand at the door and told us someone from the prosecutor's office would be in touch soon about pressing formal charges, that the evidence was strong enough to make Brandon face real consequences. We all nodded like we understood what that meant, but really, we were just exhausted, wrung out from 3 hours of recounting every horrible thing Brandon had done. Sabrina went upstairs to lie down, and I heard her door close with this soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam would have been. The next day and a half passed in this weird fog where we all moved through the house like ghosts, jumping at every sound, checking the security cameras Dad had installed every 20 minutes. Mom cooked meals nobody ate, and Dad kept his phone in his hand constantly, waiting for updates from Winston or bad news or something. I was in the kitchen making coffee I didn't want when Dad's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered on speaker, and we heard security from Mom's office building, their voice tight with stress, explaining that Brandon had shown up in the lobby demanding to see my parents about clearing up some misunderstandings. Mom's face went white, and she grabbed the phone, her hands shaking so bad she almost dropped it. The security guy said they'd already called the police per the restraining order instructions, that officers were on their way, and Brandon was getting loud and aggressive in the waiting area. Dad was already grabbing his keys, shouting that he was coming down there, but Mom stopped him with a hand on his arm and told security to keep Brandon there until the cops arrived, that under no circumstances should he be allowed to leave. We heard shouting in the background through the phone, Brandon's voice carrying that same smooth reasonableness that had fooled us all for 2 years, explaining to security that this was just a family misunderstanding and his girlfriend's brother had overreacted. Then we heard different voices, harder and more authoritative, and the security guard told us the police had arrived and were taking Brandon into custody right there in the parking lot. Mom sank into a chair and put her head in her hands while Dad stayed on the line getting details, writing down badge numbers and incident report information with this grim satisfaction on his face. Winston called an hour later to confirm Brandon had been arrested for violating the restraining order and was spending the night in county jail. His parents could bail him out in the morning, but the violation would be added to his criminal case. And Winston's voice actually sounded pleased when he explained this was good for us, that it showed the judge Brandon was dangerous and wouldn't follow court orders even when his freedom depended on it. I went upstairs to tell Sabrina and found her sitting on her bed staring at her phone, and when I signed the news, her whole body seemed to unclench, like she'd been holding her breath since yesterday. That night, while Brandon sat in a jail cell probably plotting his next move, Sabrina came downstairs with her laptop and asked if Carly could come over to help her with something. Carly arrived within an hour, her face serious but warm and settled next to Sabrina on the couch, while they pulled up Facebook and Instagram on the laptop screen. Sabrina's hands moved in quick, nervous signs as she explained she wanted to reach out to friends in the deaf community she hadn't been allowed to contact in over a year, people Brandon had systematically cut her off from by monitoring every message and controlling every interaction. Carly nodded and started helping her compose messages, and I watched from the kitchen as Sabrina typed and deleted and typed again, her fingers hesitant over keys she used to fly across. The first message went out to a woman named Jessica, who Sabrina had known since college, a simple explanation that she'd been in a bad relationship, but was out now and wanted to reconnect. The response came back in less than 5 minutes, a flood of relief and worry and love that made Sabrina start crying. Then another message, and suddenly Sabrina's phone was buzzing constantly with responses from dozens of people who'd been worried sick about her isolation and Brandon's controlling behavior, but hadn't known how to intervene. Women wrote long messages about noticing how Brandon always answered for Sabrina, how he'd made excuses for why she couldn't attend deaf community events, how something had felt wrong, but they doubted their instincts. 3 different women Sabrina had never met, sent private messages explaining that Brandon had dated them before Sabrina and shown similar red flags of control and possessiveness that had made them end things fast. One woman described how Brandon had tried to control her communication with her own deaf friends. Another talked about how he'd isolated her from her family, and a third said he'd become threatening when she tried to break up with him. Sabrina read these messages with Carly interpreting the longer ones, and I watched something shift in her face as she realized she wasn't uniquely broken or somehow deserving of Brandon's treatment, that he'd done this before and would have kept doing it. The next morning, Declan called with a referral to a therapist named Ava Livingston, who specialized in working with domestic violence survivors and had experience with deaf clients. I drove Sabrina to the appointment that afternoon, a small office in a converted house with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that felt deliberately calm. Ava was maybe 50 with kind eyes and hands that moved in fluid ASL as she introduced herself, explaining through Carly's interpretation that this first session was just about making Sabrina feel safe and starting to process what had happened. What actually happened was Sabrina cried for 45 minutes while Ava sat with her and validated every single thing she was feeling, explaining that what Brandon did was real abuse, and it wasn't Sabrina's fault, that her responses of fear and compliance were survival strategies and not weakness. Ava's voice stayed steady and warm as Carly interpreted, telling Sabrina that her brain had done exactly what it needed to do to keep her alive in a dangerous situation, that freezing and appeasing an abuser were smart responses and not character flaws. Sabrina signed questions between sobs about why she hadn't left sooner, why she'd let it go on so long, and Ava explained how abusers systematically break down their victims' ability to trust their own perceptions and seek help. By the end of the session, Sabrina looked wrung out, but somehow lighter, like crying had released pressure that had been building for months. I drove her home in silence, grateful to have this concrete way to help, even if it was just playing chauffeur twice a week. We set up a schedule for appointments every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, and I cleared my calendar without hesitation, because there was nowhere else I'd rather be than making sure my sister got to therapy. 2 weeks crawled by with a new routine of therapy appointments, Sunday dinners at our parents' house where Sabrina was actually present, instead of just physically there, and slowly reconnecting with the deaf community through video calls and careful in-person meetups. Then Mom's phone rang one evening while we were all watching a movie together, and she looked at the screen with this expression of disbelief before declining the call. It rang again immediately, and she declined again, but the third time Dad took the phone and answered with a sharp hello that made us all tense up. Brandon's mother's voice came through loud enough for all of us to hear, asking in this syrupy, sweet tone if we could all meet as families to work things out and move past this unfortunate misunderstanding. Mom grabbed the phone back and said no in this flat, hard voice I'd never heard from her before. Brandon's mother's tone changed instantly, getting sharp and accusing, insisting their son had made some mistakes, but Sabrina was overreacting and destroying a good man's reputation over relationship problems that should have stayed private. Mom's hands started shaking so bad she almost dropped the phone, and she told Brandon's mother that her son had beaten and isolated and controlled her daughter for months, that he'd violated a restraining order and been arrested, that there would be no family meeting now or ever. Brandon's father got on the line then, his voice booming about how we'd turned Sabrina against Brandon and poisoned her mind, how their son had learned a whole language for her, and this was how we repaid his devotion. Dad took the phone and told them both to never contact our family again, that if they called back, he'd report it as harassment, and hung up while they were still sputtering protests. Mom sat down hard on the couch, her whole body trembling with rage, and Dad had to physically hold her back from calling them right back to explain in graphic detail exactly what their good man had done to our daughter. The next morning, my phone started buzzing with texts from people I hadn't talked to in months, mutual friends from high school asking if I'd seen Brandon's Facebook posts. I opened the app with dread pooling in my stomach and found a long post from Brandon painting himself as the victim of a vindictive ex and her crazy family who wouldn't let him explain his side. He wrote about learning ASL to communicate with the love of his life, about how devoted he'd been for 2 years, about how one misunderstanding at a family dinner had spiraled into false accusations and a restraining order he didn't deserve. The post had dozens of comments from people who didn't know the full story, people saying they couldn't believe this about Brandon, that he'd always been such a nice guy, that there were always 2 sides to every story. Several mutual friends messaged me directly asking for both sides, and some of them seemed to actually believe Brandon's version, where he was the devoted boyfriend learning ASL, and Sabrina's family had turned her against him for no reason. I showed Sabrina the posts when she came downstairs and watched her face go gray as she read through the comments, her hands starting to shake as she saw people she'd known for years questioning whether the abuse had really happened. She had a full panic attack right there at the kitchen table, hyperventilating and signing frantically that everyone would believe him and she'd lose her entire social circle, that maybe she had overreacted and Brandon was right, that she was nothing without him. Mom and I talked her down while Dad called Ava, who squeezed in an emergency session that afternoon and spent an hour helping Sabrina understand that abusers often use social media to continue their control and manipulation after the relationship ends. A few days later, Carly called to tell us about a support group for deaf domestic violence survivors that met weekly at the Advocacy Center and asked if Sabrina might be interested in attending. Sabrina was nervous about going, signing to Carly that she didn't want to talk about Brandon with strangers, but Carly explained she could just listen the first time if she wanted, that sometimes hearing other people's stories helped survivors feel less alone. I drove Sabrina to the meeting that Thursday evening and waited in the lobby while she went into a room with 6 other deaf women and 2 facilitators. She was in there for 2 hours, and when she came out, she looked lighter than I'd seen her in months, her hands moving in rapid signs to Carly, who'd offered to stick around after the meeting. They stood in the parking lot signing back and forth for another 20 minutes, while I waited by the car, and when Sabrina finally got in, she was actually smiling, explaining that she'd met other women who understood exactly what she'd experienced, who'd dealt with abusers using ASL to control and isolate them, who knew what it felt like to be trapped in silence. The isolation Brandon had created was finally breaking, replaced by community that spoke her language both literally and in terms of shared trauma and survival. 3 weeks after that Sunday dinner intervention that had changed everything, Winston called with news that made Dad actually pump his fist in the air. 2 other women had come forward with complaints about Brandon's behavior in past relationships, coming forward after seeing the restraining order become public record and recognizing his name. One ex-girlfriend described similar patterns of control and isolation during their 6-month relationship 2 years before he'd met Sabrina, explaining how Brandon had tried to monitor her phone and control who she spent time with until she'd ended things. Another woman reported that Brandon had become threatening and showed up at her workplace repeatedly when she tried to break up with him, forcing her to get her own restraining order that had eventually expired. Winston connected us with the prosecutor handling the case, a guy named Ryan Chamberlain, who had this intensity in his voice. When he explained that pattern evidence significantly strengthened the case against Brandon, and he was moving forward with formal charges of assault, stalking, and unlawful restraint. Ryan said having multiple victims showing the same pattern of behavior made it much harder for Brandon's lawyer to claim this was just a misunderstanding or relationship dispute, that it established Brandon as someone who systematically abused romantic partners. The preliminary steps would take a few weeks, but Ryan was confident about getting a conviction that would put Brandon behind bars for real time. Brandon's criminal arraignment happened on a cold morning in early October, and Sabrina chose to attend with our whole family and Carly for support. We sat in the courthouse waiting area for an hour before Brandon was brought in, wearing clothes his parents must have brought him, looking smaller somehow without his usual charm turned on. His lawyer, some guy in an expensive suit his parents had probably mortgaged their house to afford, entered a not guilty plea in this bored voice, like this was just another Tuesday for him. I felt Sabrina tense beside me when Brandon's eyes swept the courtroom and landed on her, that same cold calculation in his gaze that I'd seen the night we threw him out. Ryan Chamberlain stood up and argued for high bail, given the restraining order violation and pattern of behavior with multiple victims, his voice carrying weight and authority that made the judge actually listen. Brandon's lawyer tried to argue his client was a respected member of the community with no prior record, but Ryan shot back with details about the workplace violation and the 2 other women who'd filed complaints. The judge set bail at $50,000, and I watched Brandon's parents in the front row realize they'd have to put up their house to get him out, saw his mother crying, and his father's face going red with anger directed at us instead of at his son. 2 weeks later, the preliminary hearing required Sabrina to testify about specific incidents of abuse, while Brandon sat 20 feet away with his lawyer taking notes. Carly stood beside Sabrina, interpreting every word she signed, and I watched my sister find strength I didn't know she still had, as she described being locked in their apartment for days at a time, having her hearing aids hidden, so she couldn't even access the small amount of sound she normally could, being told she was worthless and would never survive in the hearing world without Brandon's help navigating it. Her hands shook at first, but grew steadier as she signed about the bruises and the isolation, and the way Brandon had deliberately mistranslated her words to others to make her seem happy and grateful. Brandon's lawyer tried to ask questions that made it sound like normal relationship conflicts, but Ryan objected to almost everyone, and the judge sustained most of them. After 2 hours of testimony, the judge found sufficient evidence to move forward to trial and set a date for January, and Brandon's lawyer immediately started talking to Ryan about possible plea deals in the hallway outside the courtroom. That night after the hearing, Sabrina had her worst breakdown yet, sobbing in her childhood bedroom that she still sometimes missed Brandon, or doubted whether the abuse had really been that bad. I sat with her while she cried, not knowing what to say, until Mom called Ava, who talked to Sabrina on video chat for over an hour. Ava explained this was completely normal, that abusive relationships create trauma bonds that don't disappear just because you're physically safe now, that Sabrina's brain was processing 2 years of conditioning that had told her Brandon's love and abuse were inseparable, and you couldn't have one without the other. The complexity of Sabrina's emotions, wanting her abuser punished but also grieving the relationship she thought she had, was somehow harder to watch than her physical injuries had been. Ava helped Sabrina understand that healing wasn't linear, that she'd have good days and days where she questioned everything, and that all of those responses were normal parts of recovering from trauma this deep. I couldn't sleep that night, lying in my bed staring at the ceiling while my brain replayed every Sunday dinner from the past 2 years on loop. The way Brandon always sat between Sabrina and the rest of us, creating this physical wall. How he'd answer questions before she could, his hands moving in signs we all trusted. That time she reached for seconds, and he said she'd had enough, and we laughed like it was sweet, instead of seeing it for the control it was. Her smile never reaching her eyes, her shoulders always hunched inward, making herself smaller and smaller until she nearly disappeared. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went downstairs to make coffee I didn't really want. Mom was already in the living room, sitting on the couch with photo albums spread across the coffee table. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and puffy. I sat down next to her, and she turned one of the albums toward me, pointing at a picture from last Thanksgiving. Brandon's arm was draped over Sabrina's shoulders in that casual way that looked affectionate, his smile wide and charming for the camera. But Sabrina's eyes were empty, staring at something beyond the frame, her body rigid under his touch. We sat there for hours going through albums, finding picture after picture where the same pattern repeated. Brandon always touching her, always positioned between her and everyone else, always smiling while she looked like she was barely holding herself together. Mom's voice was quiet when she finally spoke, explaining how abusers are often the most charming people in public, how that's part of how they isolate their victims. They make everyone love them so much that nobody believes the victim when they try to get help. The guilt sat heavy in my chest, this crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. My best friend had become my sister's abuser right under my nose, and I'd been too blind to see it. I'd invited him to family dinners, clapped him on the back, called him brother. Mom put her hand on mine and said we couldn't have known, that Brandon had fooled everyone because that's what abusers do. But knowing that didn't make the guilt any lighter. A month passed with Sabrina living at our parents' house, going to therapy twice a week, slowly starting to look more like herself. One evening after dinner, Mom asked Sabrina and me to stay at the table after Dad went to watch TV. Her hands were shaking as she started signing and speaking simultaneously, telling us something she'd never shared before. Back in college, before she met Dad, she'd dated someone who did similar things to what Brandon had done. He convinced her she was lucky anyone would put up with her, that she was too difficult and too demanding, and nobody else would ever love her. He isolated her from her roommate and friends, controlled what she wore and where she went, made her feel like she was going crazy for thinking something was wrong. It took her roommate staging an intervention, physically blocking the door and refusing to let her leave until she admitted what was happening, to get her out. Mom's voice broke as she described feeling exactly what Sabrina was feeling now. That confusion about whether it was really that bad, whether she'd overreacted, whether she deserved it. Sabrina started crying and reached across the table to hold Mom's hands, their fingers intertwining in this moment of shared understanding. I sat there realizing this trauma ran deeper in our family than any of us had known, that Mom's fierce protectiveness came from understanding exactly what Sabrina had survived. She knew what it felt like to be trapped, to doubt your own mind, to think you were alone. That night changed something between the three of us, creating this bond built on shared experience and survival. 2 weeks later, Carly called to tell us about a deaf community event happening that weekend, a casual gathering at a local community center where deaf folks met to socialize and catch up. Sabrina was nervous about going, signing that she hadn't seen most of these people in over a year, that Brandon had made excuses for why she couldn't attend. Carly offered to go with her for the first few events, until she felt comfortable going alone. I drove them both there on Saturday afternoon, watching through the window as Sabrina walked into the building. She came out 3 hours later looking lighter than I'd seen her in months, her hands moving rapidly as she signed to Carly about reconnecting with friends who'd been worried about her. Over the next few weeks, she started going regularly, first with Carly and then eventually by herself. She joined a deaf women's social group that met every Thursday evening. She signed up for an ASL poetry class at the community college, something she'd always wanted to try. but Brandon had told her was a waste of time. Watching her sign freely with other deaf people, laughing and animated in ways I hadn't seen in 2 years, showed me glimpses of my real sister returning from wherever Brandon's abuse had buried her. Her hands moved with confidence again, taking up space, expressing opinions, arguing about movies and books and politics the way she used to. The isolation Brandon had created was breaking apart, replaced by community that spoke her language and understood her experience. Then, one Tuesday morning, Sabrina's phone buzzed with a message from an account she didn't recognize. The profile picture was blank, and the username was just random letters and numbers, but the message was unmistakably Brandon. Paragraphs about how much he loved her and missed her, how they could work through this if she'd just talked to him. He said he'd learned from his mistakes, that he was getting help, that their love was too special to throw away over one bad night. Sabrina's hands shook as she showed me the message, her face going pale. I immediately called Winston, who told us to forward everything and not respond. He called back an hour later saying his tech guy had traced the account back to Brandon's IP address, that creating the fake profile to contact her was another violation of the restraining order. 2 officers showed up at Brandon's parents' house that afternoon and arrested him again. This time the judge revoked his bail completely, which meant Brandon would sit in county jail until his trial. Winston explained this was actually good for us, that the second violation showed the judge Brandon was dangerous and wouldn't follow court orders even when his freedom was at stake. That night, Sabrina slept better than she had in weeks, finally able to breathe without constantly looking over her shoulder. With Brandon locked up, Ryan called to discuss a plea deal his office was offering. Brandon would plead guilty to assault and stalking charges in exchange for dropping the unlawful restraint charge, with a recommended sentence of 2 years in prison, followed by 3 years probation and mandatory domestic violence treatment. Ryan's voice was serious as he explained the options. Going to trial meant risking an acquittal despite strong evidence because juries were unpredictable and defense lawyers were good at creating reasonable doubt. The plea deal guaranteed Brandon would face real consequences and get a criminal record that would follow him forever. But it also meant accepting less prison time than he might get if convicted at trial. Sabrina had to decide whether certain punishment was better than the chance of harsher punishment or none at all. She asked for time to think about it, to discuss it with her support system before making such a big decision. Over the next week, Sabrina met with Ava, talked to Declan and Carly, sat down with our family to weigh the options. Ava helped her think through what she needed for her own healing, whether a trial would give her closure or just re-traumatize her. Declan explained the statistics, how few domestic violence cases actually result in convictions, how grueling the trial process could be. Our family listened as Sabrina signed her thoughts, respecting that this was her decision to make. Finally, she told us through Carly that she wanted Brandon to face consequences, but she also wanted this to be over. Months of trial preparation and testimony would mean months of having Brandon and his lawyers pick apart her story, question her memories, try to make her look unreliable. The plea deal meant she could focus on healing instead of reliving trauma. Ryan scheduled the plea hearing for the following Tuesday. We all went to support Sabrina, sitting in the courtroom while Brandon stood before the judge. His lawyer entered the guilty plea, and then Brandon had to allocate, which meant describing his crimes out loud in court. His voice was flat as he admitted to hitting Sabrina, isolating her from friends and family, controlling her communication with others. Hearing him say the words, admitting what he'd done, gave Sabrina this visible sense of validation. His guilt was now legal fact, not just her word against his. 3 weeks later, the sentencing hearing brought us all back to the same courtroom. Sabrina had written a victim impact statement that Carly would interpret for the court. She stood at the podium with Carly beside her, her hands moving in careful, deliberate signs as she described how Brandon's abuse had affected every part of her life. She talked about losing herself, losing her community, losing the ability to trust her own thoughts and feelings. She described the long road of recovery she was still walking, how some days she still struggled to make simple decisions because Brandon had controlled everything for so long. Her hands moved faster as she explained how he'd used her deafness against her, weaponizing the very language that should have connected them. The judge listened carefully, watching Carly's interpretation, his expression growing more serious with each sentence. When Sabrina finished, he thanked her for her courage in speaking. Then he turned to Brandon and sentenced him to the full 2 years in prison, plus 3 years probation, ordering him to have no contact with Sabrina for 10 years after his release. The gavel came down with this final, decisive sound that felt like closing a door that had been stuck open. Walking out of the courthouse that day, Sabrina seemed to stand a little taller. That night at our parents' house, She brought up something she'd been thinking about. She wanted to move into her own apartment instead of staying with mom and dad. Ava supported the idea when Sabrina brought it up in therapy, explaining it was an important step toward reclaiming independence. We were all nervous about her living alone after everything, but Sabrina insisted she needed to prove to herself that she could be independent without Brandon and without us hovering. Part of healing was trusting herself to be safe, making her own choices, controlling her own space. Mom looked worried but nodded, understanding that holding on too tight would just be another form of control. We spent the next 2 months apartment hunting together every weekend. Sabrina had specific requirements based on what Ava and Declan had suggested. Good security with cameras and locked entry. Close to the deaf community center where her support network was. Near enough to our parents that family support was available, but not so close that we'd be tempted to drop by constantly. We looked at maybe 15 places before finding the right one. A second-floor unit in a building with a security system and an attentive property manager. The lease signing felt momentous, Sabrina's hand steady as she wrote her name. Dad spent an entire weekend installing extra locks and a security system connected to his phone. Mom filled the kitchen with groceries and cooking supplies. I helped Sabrina paint the walls colors she chose herself after 2 years of Brandon deciding everything. She picked a soft blue for the bedroom and warm yellow for the living room, colors that made the space feel bright and welcoming. Watching her make decisions about furniture and decorations, seeing her personality emerge in her space, felt like watching someone come back to life. She agonized over curtains and debated between different coffee tables and rearranged the furniture 3 times until it felt right. 4 months after that Sunday dinner intervention, Sabrina moved into her apartment on a bright Saturday morning. We kept the housewarming small, just family and a few close deaf friends from the community center. People brought food and helped arrange furniture and signed conversations that filled the space with warmth. Sabrina gave us all keys, but asked that we call before coming over because she needed to practice having boundaries and controlling her own space. Mom looked like she wanted to protest, but Dad squeezed her hand, and they both nodded, understanding this was important. That night, after everyone left, Sabrina video called to show us she was okay. Her hands moved in excited signs as she walked us through each room, showing off the decorations and the view from her window. She signed that it was scary, but also exciting to be alone in a space that was entirely hers, where no one was monitoring or controlling her. For the first time in 2 years, she could make every single decision about her own life, from what time she woke up to what she ate for dinner, to whether she wanted to stay up late reading. The apartment was more than just a place to live. It was proof that she could survive, that she could build a life beyond what Brandon had tried to destroy. 2 weeks after Sabrina moved into her apartment, she invited us over for Sunday dinner, the first one she'd cook herself in her own kitchen. Mom looked nervous about letting go of the tradition, but smiled when Sabrina signed that she wanted to try hosting, that it felt important to do this herself. We arrived to find her apartment smelling like garlic and herbs, the kitchen counter covered with ingredients she'd chosen at the grocery store without anyone telling her what to buy or how much to spend. She'd gained back maybe 15 pounds since that night 4 months ago, her face fuller and healthier looking, her arms no longer hidden under long sleeves but bare in a tank top she'd picked out herself. Her style had changed completely, brighter colors and patterns that Brandon never would have let her wear, clothes that fit her body instead of hanging loose to hide bruises that didn't exist anymore. She laughed while cooking, signing jokes to Carly who'd come along to help interpret, her hands moving with confidence and speed I hadn't seen in years. We sat around her small dining table eating pasta she'd made from scratch, and nobody mentioned Brandon's name, because Ava had told us to follow Sabrina's lead, to let her control when and how she talked about her trauma, instead of making it the center of every conversation. Dad asked about her job search, and Mom complimented the apartment decorations, and I helped clear plates. While Sabrina signed about maybe adopting a cat from the shelter, just normal family dinner talk that felt like the most important thing in the world after months of crisis and court dates and police reports. 6 months after that Sunday intervention, Sabrina video called me with news that made her hands shake with excitement rather than fear. She'd applied to go back to college to finish her degree in deaf education, the one she'd abandoned 2 years ago when Brandon convinced her she wasn't smart enough to be a teacher, that she'd just embarrass herself trying. The acceptance letter had arrived that morning, and she held it up to the camera, her smile so wide I could see it even through the pixelated video. She started classes in January and threw herself into studying with intensity that surprised all of us, her apartment filling up with textbooks and notebooks covered in scribbled notes. I'd stop by sometimes to find her at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, signing complaints about impossible assignments or professors who talk too fast, normal college student stress that felt like the best thing I'd ever witnessed. She celebrated her first A with ice cream and called Mom crying happy tears. When she passed a test, she'd been terrified of failing, building a life that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the future she was creating for herself. 3 months later, 9 months after Brandon went to prison, Sabrina mentioned she'd been talking to someone from the community center, a guy named Marcus, who knew about her past and still wanted to get to know her. Mom's face went tight with worry, but Sabrina signed that Ava said it was healthy to date again when she felt ready, that Marcus was patient and respectful and understood boundaries. We met him at Sunday dinner at Sabrina's apartment 2 weeks later, and the difference from Brandon was so clear it almost hurt to see. Marcus signed directly with Sabrina as an equal, their hands moving back and forth in rapid conversation we couldn't follow without Carly's help, neither one controlling or dominating the exchange. He asked Sabrina what she wanted to eat, what movie she wanted to watch, what time worked best for her, actually asking instead of deciding for her the way Brandon always had. When Sabrina signed that she was getting tired around 9, Marcus immediately stood up and thanked us for dinner, leaving without pressure or guilt or trying to convince her to let him stay longer. Sabrina walked him to the door and came back glowing in a way I'd never seen with Brandon, a happiness that came from being respected rather than controlled, from choosing someone who saw her as a whole person instead of something to possess. On the 1-year anniversary of that Sunday intervention, Sabrina asked me to meet her somewhere specific, and when I pulled up, I realized we were at our parents' old house, the backyard where we'd made that childhood pact 23 years ago. She was already there, sitting in the grass near where our blanket fort used to stand, and when I sat down beside her, she signed that she wanted to renew our promise, but make it better. She explained through slow, careful signs that she'd learned in therapy that the signal had saved her life, but she also needed to practice asking for help directly, using her words instead of hiding behind secret codes. I promised to trust her judgment about when she needed support while staying alert anyway, because that's what the promise had always meant, and we linked pinkies the way we had as kids. This time, we were both crying, understanding the weight of promises to protect each other in ways our younger selves couldn't have imagined, knowing that some promises get heavier with time instead of lighter. A month after that anniversary, our whole family started going to therapy together once a week, sitting in Ava's office processing the guilt and trauma of missing Sabrina's abuse for so long. The sessions were brutal, Mom crying about all the Sunday dinners where she'd praised Brandon while Sabrina suffered, Dad struggling with rage at himself for not seeing through the charm to the monster underneath. Ava helped us understand that healing wasn't a straight line for anyone, that Sabrina would have bad days, and we would too, that the goal wasn't erasing what happened, but learning to move forward while carrying it. We learned to support Sabrina's recovery without smothering her, to manage our own guilt without making it her responsibility to comfort us, to be present without hovering. The sessions taught us that love meant trusting Sabrina to know what she needed, even when our instinct was to protect her from everything. 2 years after that Sunday dinner intervention that changed all our lives, Sabrina walked across a stage in a blue graduation gown to receive her diploma with honors in deaf education. The auditorium was packed with our family, friends from the Deaf Community Center, Carly and Declan and Ava, who'd all helped her get here, and Marcus sitting in the front row signing applause. She'd been hired to teach at a school for deaf children starting in the fall, her dream job doing work that mattered. At the graduation party in her apartment that night, Sabrina stood in the middle of her living room and signed a speech with Carly interpreting for the hearing people present. She thanked us for saving her life that night, but also for letting her rebuild it on her own terms, for trusting her to make her own choices even when we were scared. She wasn't the same person she'd been before Brandon, and she never would be, carrying effects of that trauma in ways that would probably last forever, but she was strong and independent and connected to community and purpose in ways that felt real and lasting. When she hugged me goodbye that night, both of us used our right hands to sign, "I love you," the normal way, the safe way. I was grateful we'd never need that left-hand signal again, but I knew I'd watch for it every single day for the rest of my life anyway, because that's what family does. That's what promises mean when you understand how much they cost and how much they're worth.